You'd walk into a Circuit City in the 1990s and get greeted by name practically, a commissioned salesperson who actually knew the difference between a CRT and the new flat panels, ready to walk you through it without hovering. For decades, that was the whole pitch. Knowledgeable people, no-haggle pricing, a superstore stacked floor to ceiling with electronics. At its peak, Circuit City was the second largest electronics retailer in the country, trailing only its rival, Best Buy, and for years before that, it had actually been the industry leader, the company that basically invented the modern electronics superstore. Then, on November 10, 2008, it filed for bankruptcy. 4 months later, every single one of its remaining 567 stores was closed for good, and more than 35,000 people lost their jobs. Best Buy, meanwhile, posted a quarterly profit of $200 million that same year. Here's the part that doesn't add up at first glance. This wasn't two companies selling different things. Same industry, same customers, same economic downturn hitting both of them at the same time. One of them didn't just survive, it thrived. The other one didn't just decline, it vanished completely, wiped off the map in a matter of months. So what actually separated them? It starts decades earlier with a Richmond, Virginia entrepreneur who built something genuinely ahead of its time, and a series of decisions made right at the top that quietly hollowed out the company from the inside, years before anyone outside the boardroom noticed. Circuit City was founded in 1949 by Samuel Wurtzel in Richmond, Virginia, originally as a small television and appliance store, decades before electronics retailer was even a category people thought about separately. Through the 70s and 80s, Wurtzel and later his successors built it into something genuinely new, a big box superstore stacked with a huge selection of TVs, stereos, and eventually computers, staffed by commissioned salespeople who actually knew the products they were selling. That combination, massive selection, competitive no-haggle pricing, and knowledgeable staff who had real financial incentive to help you find the right product, made Circuit City the dominant electronics retailer in America through the 1980s and into the 90s. For a long stretch, it wasn't playing catch-up to anyone. It was the standard other electronics retailers were trying to match. Circuit City even used its retail expertise to branch out. In 1993, its own executives helped launch CarMax, applying the same big-box, transparent pricing approach to used car sales. It became hugely successful in its own right, successful enough that Circuit City's board spun CarMax as a fully independent public company in 2002, right around the time the core electronics business was starting to visibly lose ground to a fast-growing competitor, Best Buy. That timing matters more than it might seem, because from that point forward, Circuit City wasn't the company setting the pace in its own industry, and the decisions leadership made over the next several years would make that gap almost impossible to close. Through the early 2000s, Circuit City's leadership made a series of decisions that, on paper, were framed as smart cost-cutting, but that steadily hollowed out the exact things that had made the company competitive in the first place. It exited the appliance business, walking away from a category that reliably brought in stable, repeat customers and higher-margin sales, right as competitors were leaning further into it. Between 2003 and 2007, rather than reinvesting in stores or staff, the company spent almost $1 billion buying back its own stock, a move that can prop up a share price in the short term, but does nothing to actually improve the underlying business. It didn't work anyway. Circuit City's stock still slid from around $20 a share in 2003 down to $4.20 by the end of 2007. Then came the decision that's still cited as the single biggest strategic mistake in the company's history: On March 7, 2007, Circuit City announced it was laying off roughly 3,400 of its highest-paid hourly employees, specifically targeting its most experienced, highest-earning commissioned salespeople, and replacing them with cheaper, less experienced hires. The logic was straightforward on a spreadsheet: lower payroll costs per hour. In practice, it meant the exact people who'd made walking into a Circuit City worth the trip, staff who could actually explain the difference between competing TVs, were gone, replaced with workers with a fraction of the product knowledge. That same year, CEO Philip Schoonover received close to $7 million in total compensation. The damage showed up almost immediately in customer complaints and slipping sales, right as the layoffs coincided with a broader consumer shift toward simpler product knowledge and lower margins. And then, in late 2008, the economy collapsed entirely underneath the company at the worst possible moment. On November 10, 2008, Circuit City filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company immediately closed 155 underperforming stores and laid off 17% of its remaining workforce, hoping the initial cuts would buy time to restructure and find a buyer. That buyer never showed up. Vendors had already grown wary of the company's finances. Circuit City reportedly owed more than $100 million combined to suppliers like Sony and HPW, debts that made those companies reluctant to keep extending credit at exactly the moment Circuit City needed inventory the most. By January 2009, with no viable buyer found, a bankruptcy court approved full liquidation. It's worth sitting with what that actually means: not a restructuring, not a smaller, leaner version of the company living on, a complete winding down with every asset sold off to pay creditors. Liquidation sales ran through the winter, and by March 8, 2009, all 567 remaining Circuit City stores had closed permanently. More than 35,000 people lost their jobs in the process. That May, a company called Systemax bought what was left of the brand, the name, the trademarks, the CircuitCity.com domain, for $14 million, a fraction of what the company had once been worth. Best Buy, meanwhile, spent that same stretch doing almost everything Circuit City had done, investing in its appliance category instead of abandoning it, building major in-store partnerships with brands like Apple, and continuing to invest in its sales staff and e-commerce presence instead of gutting them for short-term savings. Retail analyst David Schick summed it up simply at the time. Circuit City had been enormously successful in the 80s and 90s, but the company simply never changed after that. It's a reminder that industries rarely kill companies outright. Usually, the company spends years making the choices that leave it defenseless long before the crisis that finally finishes the job arrives. Subscribe for more Vanished Chains. We're breaking down the exact decisions that took down brands you grew up with. Next time, we're looking at Toys R Us, a chain that survived nearly 70 years of competition, only to be brought down by a form of debt most shoppers never even knew existed. Did you ever shop at a Circuit City? What do you remember about it? Tell me in the comments. Best Buy and Circuit City faced the exact same storm. Only one of them had spent years patching the holes in the boat.